Welcome to The Explainer. We're about to dive into one of history's biggest and, let's be honest, toughest questions. What really set off the massive global conflicts of the 20th century? Together, we're going to untangle this incredibly complex web of political ambition and economic pressure that basically lit the world on fire. We're going to start with this really powerful quote from Albert Einstein, which he said right as the deadliest war in human history was finally ending. It's a pretty heavy thought, right? This idea that maybe, just maybe, conflict is kind of baked into the system when you have a world full of powerful competing nations. It really frames our whole discussion. So, this is the big question guiding us today. See, it's not enough to just make a list of what caused these wars. We need to figure out which ones were the most important, which factors were the real tipping points that pushed everything over the edge. That's what we're aiming for in this explainer. So here's our game plan. First, we'll dig into the political stuff. Then we'll shift over the economic drivers. After that, we'll take a hard look at the absolutely massive effects of these wars. And to wrap it all up, we'll give you a kind of mental toolkit for how to analyze these causes on your own. Okay, let's jump right in. In this first part, we're going to explore the political triggers that plunged the world into war, not just once, but twice in a generation. So, World War I, people call it the first total war, but it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was more like a powder keg that had been building for years, and these four things were the main ingredients. You had this tangled mess of alliances that could turn a small fight into a world war. You had super intense nationalism, a huge military buildup where everyone was trying to outdo each other, and, of course, a fierce competition for colonies and resources. And this, right here, is where you really see the global scale of what was supposed to be a European war. I mean, just look at these numbers. 1.5 million soldiers from India alone. That's staggering. It shows you how the massive reach of colonialism meant that when Europe went to war, it dragged the rest of the world down with it. Now, this slide shows a truly terrifying evolution. That intense nationalism from World War I, it didn't just vanish. It mutated. In places like Italy and Germany, it ballooned into fascism, which is basically nationalism on steroids, mixed with a dictator and a powerful army. And that's what set the stage for the next, even deadlier war. This is such a critical point to understand. The political cause of World War II was really a two-part failure. On one side, you had these aggressive expansionist powers in Germany and Japan. But on the other side, you had this policy of appeasement, where other countries kept giving them what they wanted, hoping to avoid a fight. In the end, that inaction just enabled them. Okay, let's move on, because you can't understand these wars without talking about money. Behind all the politics and the flags and the ideologies, there was another incredibly powerful driver: the hunt for money and resources. When you boil it all down, a lot of this conflict came from a simple economic need that was supercharged by the Industrial Revolution. Countries needed raw materials for their factories, and then they needed new markets where they could sell all the stuff they were making. This constant, high-stakes competition for economic control was a major source of tension. And this is the perfect case study. It's not just a military story, it's a chain reaction that was sparked by economics. Step 1, Japan needs oil to fuel its empire and war machine. Step 2, the US cuts them off with an embargo. Step 3, Japan decides its only way out is to attack the US fleet, get them out of the way, and go take the resources it needs. It's a straight line from an economic problem to a military attack. And we absolutely cannot forget the impact of a total economic meltdown. The Great Depression caused unbelievable suffering and desperation all over the world. In Germany, it created the perfect breeding ground for a leader like Hitler to rise to power by promising people jobs, a restored sense of national pride, and a way out of the crisis. So we've looked at the political and economic causes. Now we need to turn to the consequences. And they were absolutely staggering. They reshaped our entire planet. Just take a second and look at that number. 20 million. That's the estimated number of civilians who died in just one country, China, during World War II. It's a number so huge, our brains can barely even process what it means. This chart really puts it into perspective. With new technologies like long-range bombers and absolutely horrific policies targeting entire groups of people, civilians weren't on the sidelines of war anymore. They were right on the front lines. The human cost was unlike anything the world had ever seen.
The political map of the world was just completely shredded and redrawn. Think about it. Ancient empires, the Russian, the Ottoman, the King, they just vanished. The old colonial powers were exhausted, which sparked independence movements all across the globe. And rising from all that rubble were two new superpowers who would dominate the New World Order, the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is one of the most incredible long-term effects. These wars literally bled the old colonial powers, like Britain and France, dry of their money and their manpower. They simply couldn't afford to hang on to their massive empires anymore, and that kicked off this huge wave of decolonization that led to the birth of dozens of new countries.
Okay, so with all these complicated, overlapping causes, how do we even begin to make sense of it all? How do we decide what was really important? Well, this final section is all about giving you a framework for how to think like a historian.
This is how you really dig deeper. You start asking these kinds of questions. For instance, was nationalism this deep, underlying cause, while the assassination of an archduke was just the spark that lit the fuse? Was an economic embargo just one domino in a long chain of events? This is how you go from just listing facts to actually understanding history.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most important thought. You look at these causes, tangled alliances, intense nationalism, fierce economic competition. The really scary question is, how many of those things are still major forces in our world right now? It just goes to show you that understanding the past isn't just an academic exercise, it's absolutely essential for understanding the world we're living in today.